It was an otherwise routine evening on the Global Truth Network, a late-night television program known for probing interviews and occasionally sensational stories, when Chuck Norris, martial artist, actor, and icon, walked onto the stage. The host, Laura Jennings, greeted him with a wide smile and a firm handshake, leading him toward the deep leather chairs placed beneath the intense, hot lighting. The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet at the sheer presence of the man who had become a living legend. Chuck sat down, adjusted his denim jacket, and offered a modest smile that belied the powerful persona he was known for. At first, the conversation was casual. They spoke about his early days as a struggling karate teacher, his journey into Hollywood, and, of course, the endless jokes and memes that celebrated his mythical strength. Chuck laughed easily, leaning into the jokes, but there was a glint in his eye, something deeper, something waiting just beneath the surface. Laura, sensing an opportunity, leaned in, lowering her voice conspiratorially as she asked, "Come on, Chuck. With all you've done, surely you have one story you've never told before? Something unbelievable." The studio lights seemed to dim slightly as Chuck shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. For a moment, it seemed as if he might dismiss the question with another laugh. But then, surprisingly, he leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, and said, "There is one thing I've never talked about. Not in any book, not in any interview." The room seemed to hold its breath. Chuck's voice was low, almost reluctant. "Back in the early 1960s, before Hollywood, before the fame, I was involved in a very secretive government program. It was called the Peacekeeper Initiative. The goal was simple: train individuals from all over the world in martial arts, strategy, diplomacy, and ethics. We were meant to become global guardians, ready to intervene in crises before they could erupt." He paused, gauging the reaction. Laura's mouth opened slightly in astonishment, but she said nothing. Chuck continued, "I was one of the American representatives, and while stationed for training in Buenos Aires, Argentina, I met a young man, a seminary student. His name was Jorge Mario Bergoglio." There was a stunned silence across the studio. It was a name known to billions, the birth name of Pope Francis. Chuck's eyes softened with memory. He was determined, disciplined, and there was something else about him, a kind of light. He was already deeply spiritual, but he trained harder than anyone I had ever seen. He believed physical strength could protect spiritual missions. The control room behind the scenes buzzed with frantic energy. Producers whispered urgently into their headsets, debating whether to cut the feed. But Laura pressed on, voice quivering slightly. "You're telling us you trained with Pope Francis?" Chuck smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Trained with him, fought alongside him, laughed with him. I knew even then he was destined for something much bigger." The audience barely moved. Phones started vibrating in pockets as texts flew from viewers at home. Twitter exploded in real time. Hashtags like hashtag #ChuckandFrancis and hashtag Holy Warrior immediately trending. Commentators from every corner of the internet scrambled for old photos, documents, anything that could substantiate what many thought must be an elaborate prank. Laura pressed further. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Chuck's expression grew grave. "Because we were sworn to secrecy." The Peacekeeper Initiative wasn't just about training. It was about preparing for a global upheaval, something they believed would come in our lifetime. They made it clear, if we spoke, we wouldn't just be risking ourselves. We'd be putting millions of lives in danger, including the lives of people we loved. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed from lighthearted entertainment to something darker, heavier. Even the air felt thicker, harder to breathe. Laura's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass, her eyes never leaving Chuck's. "And you have proof?" she asked hesitantly. Chuck, without a word, reached beneath his seat and pulled out a small leather-bound folder. From it, he withdrew a photograph, faded, creased at the corners, but clear enough. The camera zoomed in. It showed a young Chuck Norris, unmistakable even with the passage of time, standing beside a grinning Jorge Bergoglio. Both wore plain military-style uniforms. Both bore black belts tied tightly around their waists. And most shockingly of all, on the wall behind them was a symbol, a sigil no one could immediately identify. Gasps erupted from the audience. Some clapped their hands over their mouths. A few journalists sitting in the front row sprang from their seats, snapping photos with their phones. Laura, voice now almost a whisper, asked, "What does the symbol mean?" Chuck shook his head slowly. "I don't know. They never told us. But Jorge Francis used to say it represented the guardians of a sacred trust. I thought he was just being poetic back then. Now, I'm not so sure." Before Laura could respond, a strange flickering began across the screens. At first, just a line of static. Then bizarre, cryptic symbols appeared, dancing like ghosts across the television broadcast. Latin phrases scrolled across the bottom of the screen, words so old and obscure that even scholars would need hours to translate them. The audience panicked slightly, murmuring in confusion and fear. The broadcast cut to black for 3 full minutes. Across the world, millions of viewers stared into darkness, feeling an almost primal fear gnaw at them. When the feed returned, Chuck's chair was empty. Laura sat alone, blinking rapidly, her face chalk white. A low hum filled the background, an eerie, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the studio. Viewers flooded online forums, desperate for answers. Some claimed Chuck had been extracted mid-broadcast by government agents. Others said they saw shadowy figures appear behind him just before the cut. Theories ranged from secret Vatican orders to ancient conspiracies hidden for centuries. But one thing was undeniable. Chuck Norris had just dropped a truth bomb so massive the ripples would shake the very foundations of faith, government, and history. And somewhere out there, the forces he had spoken of, forces long dormant, long hidden, had clearly decided it was time to act. The world would never be the same again. The morning after Chuck Norris's shocking live revelation, the world woke to a new reality. News anchors, bloggers, podcasters, and political pundits all struggled to keep up with the tidal wave of information flooding every platform. Video clips of the interview replayed endlessly, dissected frame by experts and conspiracy theorists alike. Analysts pointed out the subtle changes in Chuck's voice, the hidden symbols in the photograph, and even the strange interference that had glitched the broadcast into chaos. Overnight, Chuck Norris had become not just a cultural icon, but the unlikely catalyst of a global awakening. The Vatican remained silent. For 24 agonizing hours, no official statement was released. Journalists camped outside St. Peter's Basilica, their cameras trained on every door and window, desperate for a glimpse of Pope Francis or any high-ranking clergy member. Meanwhile, behind the heavy stone walls of the Vatican, ancient corridors buzzed with nervous energy. Cardinals and bishops held emergency meetings deep within the Apostolic Palace, trying to assess the damage. At the heart of it all was a grim realization. The secret they had fought so hard to bury for decades was now clawing its way back into the light. Online, amateur sleuths scoured every resource for clues about the mysterious guardians of the sacred trust mentioned by Chuck. Within hours, obscure historical documents surfaced, linking the name to a secret society allegedly founded during the Crusades. According to these unverified texts, the Guardians were originally a militant religious order tasked with protecting certain divine artifacts, items said to possess unimaginable power. Over the centuries, the group had evolved, becoming less about protecting physical objects and more about safeguarding dangerous truths. Allegedly, their most sacred duty was to ensure that humanity remained ignorant of certain knowledge that, if revealed, could tear apart the world's most deeply held beliefs. Shockingly, many of the documents suggested that some popes had not merely been spiritual leaders, but active members of this clandestine group. They were guardians, gatekeepers of forbidden history. And now, with Chuck Norris's slip, the fragile veil was crumbling. As the media frenzy grew, strange events began to unfold. High-profile political figures, once known for their close ties to the Vatican, suddenly resigned, citing personal reasons. Entire archives of religious texts mysteriously disappeared from universities and seminaries overnight. Internet servers hosting ancient manuscripts went dark. Key historians and theologians, people who might have helped the world understand what was happening, vanished without a trace. Rumors of abductions, covert military operations, and silenced whistleblowers spread like wildfire. In Rome, Pope Francis convened a secret council known as the Concilium Tenebris, the Council of Shadows, a group so secretive that most within the Vatican itself had believed it was a myth. This council, composed of cardinals, ancient order representatives, and even secular power brokers, gathered in a hidden catacomb beneath the city. Their objective was singular: contain the breach before it unraveled everything. Meanwhile, Chuck Norris himself had gone off the grid. His home in Texas stood empty. His phone lines were disconnected. His family issued a terse statement, saying he was taking time to reflect. But whispers emerged that Chuck hadn't simply disappeared. He had been contacted. An anonymous source claimed that a splinter faction within the Guardians had reached out to Chuck, believing that the time had come to reveal the truth the Vatican had long buried. The world teetered on the edge of mass panic. Some religious leaders condemned Chuck, calling him a tool of deception, an unwitting pawn of dark forces. Others hailed him as a prophet, chosen to shatter the chains of ignorance. Protests erupted in major cities. Some demanded transparency from a church. Others burned effigies of Chuck Norris in a strange blend of fear and rage. Amid this chaos, a breakthrough occurred. A group of rogue archivists, operating out of an undisclosed location, leaked a centuries-old manuscript to the public. The document, written in cryptic Latin and Greek, described a prophecy: when the guardian of the East and the shepherd of the West reunite, the hidden covenant shall be broken, and mankind shall remember what was forgotten. Analysts immediately interpreted the guardian of the East as Chuck Norris, trained in ancient arts, and the shepherd of the West as Pope Francis, the spiritual leader from Argentina. The covenant, it seemed, referred to a deliberate suppression of knowledge, the true origin of human history, extraterrestrial contact, and divine interventions long erased from public consciousness. For centuries, only the Guardians had known the full extent of it. Now, the covenant was fracturing. In retaliation, the secret society moved swiftly. Key witnesses to Chuck's original story were discredited, disappearing from public view under a cloud of scandals and accusations. The Vatican issued a highly choreographed press release, framing Chuck's statements as the unfortunate ramblings of a beloved entertainer, but few believed it. The damage was done. Public trust in religious and political institutions plummeted to historic lows. More chillingly, isolated incidents of violence began popping up globally. A historian in Paris was found dead under suspicious circumstances after posting ancient maps online. A seminary professor in Mexico City vanished hours after discussing the artifacts of light mentioned in forbidden gospels. In Sydney, Australia, an amateur theologian was hospitalized after surviving an assassination attempt linked to his research on lost Christian doctrines. The pattern was clear. Those who knew too much or spoke too loudly were being silenced. Yet, despite the danger, an underground movement grew. Calling themselves Veritas Lux, the light of truth, they organized online and in hidden meetings. Their goal was to protect Chuck, locate missing artifacts, and ultimately bring everything into the open. Among their leaders were former intelligence agents, dissident priests, and scholars once sworn to secrecy, but now determined to expose the Guardians. At the center of it all, Pope Francis wrestled with an impossible choice. As a young man, he had dreamed of using his training for peace and truth. Now, burdened with papal authority, he was trapped between protecting a centuries-old system and honoring a friendship and mission long forgotten. Eyes hollow, heart heavy, he realized that the very foundations of the faith he had pledged his life to uphold were crumbling from within. And in the shadows of the Vatican, an ancient ritual began. The remaining leaders of the secret society gathered around a relic said to be imbued with unimaginable power. Their intention was clear: to seal the covenant once and for all, or destroy anyone who stood in their way. As whispers of an impending confrontation grew louder, the world watched, breathless. Somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the final pieces were moving into place, and Chuck Norris was preparing to finish what he had started. The world had been holding its breath for days. Tensions rose to an unbearable pitch. Governments braced for riots. Churches fortified their cathedrals. News channels ran 24-hour speculation loops. Everyone knew something monumental was coming, but no one could predict exactly what. Then, without warning, every major network on Earth was overtaken by a simple, black screen bearing a cryptic message: prepare for revelation. The timer beneath it began to count down. 3 hours. Across continents, millions abandoned their daily routines. Airports shut down as passengers crowded terminal TVs. Markets froze. Streets emptied. Inside living rooms, bars, airports, shelters, and hospitals, humanity huddled around flickering screens, captivated by the ticking clock. Speculation ran wild. Some feared nuclear war. Others whispered of alien disclosure. But a few, those who had followed the Chuck Norris broadcast, knew the truth was far stranger. As the clock hit 0, the black screen dissolved into a view of an ancient underground hall, its stone walls lined with torches that hissed and flickered. A massive, circular table sat at the center, where robed figures gathered, faces hidden in the shadows. Emblazoned behind them was the same strange sigil seen in the photograph Chuck had revealed. The camera panned, and gasps rippled across the globe. Standing defiantly before the secret society was none other than Chuck Norris, clad not in the denim and leather of his usual public image, but in a simple, dark GI, the uniform he had worn all those decades ago in Argentina. At his side stood Pope Francis, wearing his traditional white robes, but with a silver cross that gleamed like fire in the torchlight. Chuck's face was hard, determined. Pope Francis's expression was one of profound sorrow mixed with iron resolve. The leader of the robed figures, a gaunt man whose voice crackled with menace, spoke first. "You should not have come," he hissed. His voice was translated instantly into dozens of languages on screens around the world. "You were both meant to protect the covenant, not shatter it." Pope Francis stepped forward, his voice steady and thunderous. "We were meant to protect humanity, not imprison it in ignorance." Chuck followed, his words cutting like a blade. "Truth isn't dangerous. Fear of truth is." The robed man laughed bitterly. "If the world learns what we have hidden, they will destroy themselves. You know this. You've seen it." At this, Chuck glanced toward the camera, directly into the eyes of billions watching from every corner of Earth. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe the world deserves a chance to choose its own destiny." A silence fell, thick as concrete. For a moment, it seemed the confrontation might end peacefully. But then the robed figures began to chant in a low, guttural tone. The walls trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Hidden mechanisms groaned to life, and the floor near the table cracked open, revealing an ancient artifact, a crystalline sphere pulsing with blinding white light. Viewers around the world shielded their eyes as the light intensified. Rumors had long spoken of divine relics, objects not of this earth. Now, in front of billions, proof shone in full, terrible majesty. The lead figure raised his hands. "We control the covenant. You cannot stop what has already begun." But he underestimated Chuck Norris. Moving faster than any camera could fully capture, Chuck leapt into action. In one fluid motion, he roundhouse kicked the artifact, not to destroy it, but to sever the energy bonds tethering it to the Guardian's control. The force of his blow triggered a massive surge of energy, knocking the robed figures backward like ragdolls. Pope Francis moved next, raising his silver cross high. A beam of pure light shot from the artifact into the cross, then refracted outward, sending waves of calming, golden energy through the room, and through every television screen broadcasting the event. Around the globe, people felt it. Wars paused. Riots stopped mid-throw. Enemies embraced without understanding why. An overwhelming sense of peace and unity washed over humanity, eroding barriers built over centuries. The secret society, their power broken, scattered like leaves before a storm. Chuck and Francis approached the artifact together. With a solemn nod, they each placed a hand upon it. In that moment, visions poured into the minds of every human being. Ancient civilizations far older than history acknowledged. Celestial beings not as gods, but as fellow travelers guiding early humanity. Hidden truths about consciousness, energy, and the limitless potential within each soul. The broadcast lasted only minutes, but the impact would echo through generations. When a screen faded back to black, people everywhere wept openly, not from sadness but from awe. Humanity had not been made small by the truth. Humanity had been made vast, limitless, connected. Later that evening, Chuck Norris and Pope Francis appeared together again. This time at a formal press conference atop the steps of the newly opened Hall of Humanity in Rome. Cameras flashed wildly as they stood side by side. An unthinkable alliance forged in fire and secrecy, now revealed for all to see. Pope Francis, voice firm, addressed the world. Faith without truth is tyranny. Knowledge without compassion is destruction. Today we end both. Today we walk together. Chuck spoke next, his usual humor tempered by a grave sincerity. We thought the world couldn't handle the truth. Turns out, the world was just waiting for someone to trust it with the truth. Questions rained down from reporters. What would happen to governments? To organized religion? To history books? Chuck and Francis answered simply, change will come. Some will resist it. Some will cling to old ways. But the future belongs to those who embrace it together. Behind them, banners were unfurled bearing a new symbol. Not the old sigil of secrecy, but a luminous tree, its branches weaving across the globe, roots anchored deep into the stars. The guardians of the sacred trust were no more. In their place rose the keepers of the light, a movement open to all people, all faiths, all nations, dedicated not to hiding the truth but living it. Chuck Norris, once an action hero, was now a different kind of warrior, a guardian of humanity's potential. Pope Francis, once bound by centuries of secrecy, was now a shepherd leading his flock into a new age of enlightenment. And somewhere, in the swirling mists of time, the forces that had long watched over humanity stirred once more, not as jailers, but as proud witnesses to a species finally stepping into its own light. The world would never be the same. It would be better.